In the vast, brutal calculus of war, ships are weapons. They are measurements of steel, tonnage, and firepower, expected to fight, to endure, and, if necessary, to sink, taking their secrets and their sailors to the cold, dark bottom. We measure naval history in victories and losses, in battleships that ruled the waves and carriers that projected power across continents. But history is full of anomalies, stories that defy the ledger of gains and losses. These are the stories of the unexpected, the improbable, the impossible. What happens when a weapon refuses to die? What happens when a ship, already counted among the dead, already written off as a loss, decides to fight back? This isn't the story of an invincible dreadnought or a glorious flagship. This is the story of a vessel that was given up for lost, a ghost of the fleet that had every reason to surrender to the sea. It is the story of how a single, battered, and critically wounded ship, floating on little more than courage and bilge water, became one of the most unlikely and decisive heroes of the war. Welcome to War Chronicles. The story you are about to hear is a testament to the fact that in the crucible of combat, the greatest strength isn't always about the thickness of the armor, but the resilience of the human spirit. Before we dive into the dark waters of the Pacific, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Hit that like button if you believe in impossible stories, and let us know in the comments which country and city you are watching from. We love to see how far these stories of bravery travel. Now, lock the hatches. We're heading into the storm. The ship was the USS Harridan, DD-391, a name that, by 1943, seemed almost too appropriate. She was an old Farragut-class destroyer, launched in an era of peacetime optimism, yet now finding herself hopelessly outmatched in the technological meat grinder of the South Pacific. Her crew, a mix of grizzled veterans from the Canal campaign and fresh-faced replacements who still looked pale around the gills, called her the Hag. She was noisy, she was cramped, and her engines were prone to fits of petulant coughing that sounded terminal. But she was their ship, a small, gray sliver of American territory in an ocean that seemed determined to swallow them whole. She was operating as part of Task Force 17, a screen for the carriers Hornet and Enterprise, but in the chaotic, swirling battles near the Solomon Islands, screens were often shattered. The Harridan, pushed to its limits, had been chasing a phantom sonar contact when it happened. The sea, previously a flat, mercury-colored sheet under the oppressive afternoon sun, erupted. It wasn't a torpedo from a submarine, as they feared, but a new, terrifying threat. A squadron of Japanese G4M Betty bombers, flying low and fast, unleashing a salvo of air-launched torpedoes. It was a perfectly executed anvil attack. The Harridan's anti-aircraft guns, the 20mm Oerlikons and the 40mm Bofors, screamed themselves hoarse, painting the sky with black puffs of flak, but the bombers were relentless. The first torpedo ripped into the destroyer's starboard side, just aft of the bow, creating a wound large enough to drive a truck through. The shockwave was biblical. Men were thrown from their feet. Steel plates shrieked as they were torn apart, and a geyser of fuel oil, seawater, and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The Harridan shuddered, a mortal blow that seemed to stop her heart. A second torpedo followed almost instantly, this one a deeper, more sinister impact. It struck the port side, amidships, right in the guts of the ship. The aft engine room vanished in a colossal blast of superheated steam and fire. The ship's spine was broken. She immediately lost all power, her guns falling silent, her radar going dark. The Harridan began to list, heavily and sickeningly, to starboard, her bow already dipping beneath the waves. The intercom, miraculously still functional for a few seconds, crackled with the most dreaded order in any navy. All hands, prepare to abandon ship. The bombers, their deadly work seemingly done, circled once, like vultures admiring their kill. They could see the men on the forecastle, now canted at a severe angle, struggling to release the life rafts. They saw the fires breaking out near the torpedo tubes. The Harridan was dying, listing, and visibly sinking by the bow. Satisfied, the Bettys turned east and vanished into the clouds, radioing back to Rabaul that an American destroyer had been confirmed sunk. On the bridge, Commander Elias Thorne, the Harridan skipper, clung to the ship's wheel, his face a mask of grease and grim determination. He watched the bombers disappear. Below his feet, he could hear the terrifying groan of bulkheads collapsing under the pressure of the incoming sea. The ship was wallowing, every wave washing over the main deck. She was sinking. But Commander Thorne knew something the Japanese pilots didn't. He knew his ship. He knew that the Farragut class, for all its faults, had been built with redundant longitudinal bulkheads that the Harridan's chief engineer, Lieutenant Fixit Malone, had spent the last 6 months reinforcing on his own initiative. The first torpedo had opened her up, but the second torpedo, striking the port side, had, in a bizarre twist of fate, helped to balance the initial list. The engine room was gone, yes. The ship was a wreck, absolutely. But the flooding, while catastrophic, was slowing. "Belay that order!" Thorne's voice cut through the panic, a raw, powerful command that stopped the men in their tracks. "Damage control parties, get those fires out! Malone!" he yelled down the voice tube. "How long do we have?" The voice that came back was choked with smoke, but it was alive. "She's not sinking, Skipper. She's just resting. The forward compartments are flooded and the aft is burning, but the center is holding. I can't give you engines, but I can give you buoyancy. If we can shift the ammo from the forward magazine, we might just level her out." Thorne looked at the sea. The rest of the task force was miles away, fighting its own battles, unaware of their fate. They were alone. They were wounded, and they were, to any outside observer, a sinking ship. A wreck, useless. A slow, wolfish grin spread across Commander Thorne's face. In this part of the ocean, being useless could be the greatest camouflage of all. He knew that just 20 miles away over the horizon was the Japanese resupply route known as the Slot. The enemy pilots had just reported this patch of ocean clear, marked by the grave of one very dead American destroyer. "Get the fires under control, but make the smoke look bad," Thorne ordered. "Secure all watertight doors. We're not abandoning ship, gentlemen. We're going hunting." The Harridan was a snapshot of hell. Below decks, the scene was a grotesque symphony of destruction. The second torpedo, the one that had gutted the aft engine room, had sent a shockwave of pressurized steam and superheated oil through the adjoining compartments. Men had been scalded instantly, their screams silenced by the roar of the explosion. Now, the passageways were a dark, treacherous maze. The red glow of battle lanterns flickering on emergency battery power barely penetrated the acrid, chemical-laden smoke. The water was knee-deep, then waist-deep in the lower levels, a cold, oily soup that carried with it the debris of the crew's former lives. Playing cards, letters from home, a shattered phonograph. Lieutenant Malone, Fixit, was not a man given to panic. He was a broad-shouldered man from the shipyards of Boston, who understood a ship's soul not through navigation charts, but through blueprints and the feel of a vibrating bulkhead. He was in Damage Control Central, or what was left of it, when the order to abandon ship was countermanded. A grim smile had touched his lips. "About damn time," he muttered. He and his teams were already at work, not as sailors, but as plumbers, as firefighters, as surgeons. "She's bleeding, but she's not dead." Malone bellowed over the din of a portable gasoline pump they'd miraculously started. "The main longitudinals are holding. The blast in the aft engine room blew out the hull plates, but the forward engine room bulkhead is sealed. We've got a ship in two halves, boys. The front and the back are flooded, but the middle is ours." They were fighting a war of inches. Teams of men, naked to the waist, waded into the dark, flooded compartments, their only light coming from helmet-mounted lamps. They had to manually close watertight doors that were warped and buckled by the blast. They used wooden shoring, great beams of timber, to brace the bulkheads that groaned and wept under the immense pressure of the Pacific. This was a medieval battle, fought with hammers, wedges, and raw strength inside the guts of a 20th century war machine. Up on the bridge, Commander Thorne was doing a different kind of math. He had his executive officer, Lieutenant Reynolds, assess their combat readiness. The report was beyond grim. "Skipper, here's the state of play," Reynolds said, his voice flat, his face pale. "We have no propulsion. Zero. The aft engine room is a submerged cavern. The forward engine room is flooded to the turbines. We are dead in the water. We have no primary electricity. The generators are gone. We're on battery power for comms and a few lights. That means no radar, no sonar, no main gun directors." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "The aft 5-inch guns are gone. Mounts 3 and 4 are twisted metal, probably at the bottom of the ocean. The fires amidships have cooked off the ready ammo for the Bofors. We have, maybe, 2 torpedoes left in the starboard tubes that aren't jammed, and we have the forward guns, Mount 1 and 2, but without the main director they're just glorified shotguns. We'd have to aim them by eye. A sinking ship, no power, no engines, no radar. Most of its guns gone. It was a tomb." "Good," Thorne said. Reynolds stared at him. "Sir?" "They saw us get hit. They saw us burn. They saw us list. They reported us sunk," Thorne explained, his voice low and intense, grabbing Reynolds by the shoulder. "The Japanese pilots who did this are already back at their base, drinking sake and collecting their medals. To them, we are a new reef. We do not exist." He pointed over the shattered windscreen, toward the horizon that was beginning to bleed into the purples and oranges of sunset. "But we are still here, and the slot is right over there. Every night, like clockwork, they run destroyers down that channel. The Tokyo Express. They use it to resupply Guadalcanal, to land troops, to shell Henderson Field. And they do it fast, because they think they own the night." "But they won't be expecting a ghost, sir," Reynolds said, the commander's desperate, insane logic slowly taking root. "Exactly," Thorne snapped. "They won't be expecting a ghost. They won't be looking for a burning, half-sunk American destroyer sitting right in the middle of their highway. They'll sail right past us full speed, their guards down. And when they do—" Thorne looked at his executive officer. The plan was suicide. It was also, perhaps, the only chance they had. Not to survive, necessarily, but to matter. "Mr. Malone," Thorne's voice crackled over the emergency battery-powered sound tube. "You said you could level us out." "I can try, Skipper," Malone's voice returned, tinny and distant. "If we shift the ammo from the forward magazine, counterflood a few of the portside voids, we can get her off this heavy starboard list. But what's the point? She'll still be a wreck." "That's exactly the point, Malone," Thorne said. "I don't want her leveled. I want her managed. Can you keep us at a 5-degree list? Just enough to look crippled? Can you keep the fires burning? But just the superficial stuff? I want smoke, Malone. I want the world to see the Harridan as a burning pyre. I want the next Japanese patrol plane that flies over to see a corpse. We are going to play dead until the sun goes down." A long silence came from the tube. The men on the bridge could hear the distant, muffled shouting of the damage control teams. Then Malone's voice, no longer just an engineer, but a co-conspirator. "Smoke. You want smoke? I can give you smoke. I'll burn old mattresses, oil-soaked rags in the galley stack. I can make this tub look like a funeral pyre from 5 miles away. And the list? Yes, Skipper. I can hold her at 5 degrees. We'll be a sitting duck, but we'll be the most convincing corpse in the Pacific." The crew, those who weren't in the critical damage control parties, were huddled on the forecastle, the only part of the ship that felt remotely stable, though it was angled sharply toward the sea. They were exhausted, soaked in oil and seawater, and terrified. They had heard the order to abandon ship, and then the order to belay it. They were in limbo, sailors on a ship that was no longer a ship. Thorne had his bosun's mate gather them. He didn't use the 1MC, the ship-wide address system. It was dead. He just stood on the turret of Mount 1, his hands on his hips, and let his voice carry in the sudden, eerie quiet of the dying afternoon. The only sounds were the hiss of the fires, the lapping of the waves against their wounded hull, and the metallic groans of the ship itself. "Men," he shouted. His voice was raw. "The Japanese think they killed us today. They're wrong. They just gave us an opportunity. They think we're at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. They're wrong. We are right where we need to be. Tonight, the Tokyo Express comes through, and we are the toll booth." He pointed to the 2 5-inch guns beneath his feet. "We have these. We have 2 torpedoes. And we have the element of surprise. They will come to us, and we will send them to the hell they thought they sent us." He looked at the young faces staring back at him, boys who had been at sea for 6 months and now looked like ancient veterans. They called this ship the Hag. Tonight she shows them her teeth. We will hold here. We will wait. And we will fight. Dismissed. There was no cheering. There was only a grim, quiet, and terrifyingly profound acceptance. They were no longer a crew trying to save a ship. They were ghosts haunting their own vessel, waiting for the dark. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the Harridan into an inky blackness, the trap was set. The sinking ship, now just a smudge of smoke and a dark shape against the water, waited. Night in the Solomon Islands is not a gentle affair. It does not fall, it suffocates. The sun vanishes, and an oppressive, humid darkness clamps down, absolute and blinding. For the men of the USS Harridan, this was a new kind of terror. They were adrift, a broken piece of steel in an infinite, hostile ocean, and they were trying to be invisible. But the Harridan was not a quiet ship, even in death. She was a chorus of suffering. The deep guttural groans of stressed metal echoed from below, a sound like a giant in agony. Bulkheads, shored up by desperate men, creaked and wept as they fought against the crushing weight of the Pacific. The water, which now claimed nearly half the ship, was a living presence, lapping and sucking at the dark, flooded compartments. Above it all, the sound of their own manufactured fires, Lieutenant Malone's special effect, a steady, controlled hiss and crackle from the galley stack, where a dedicated team fed it just enough oily rags and splintered wood to send up a believable column of greasy smoke. It was a charade of destruction, a play performed for an audience they prayed was watching from afar and dreaded would come too close. On the bridge, Commander Thorne stood in the shattered remains of the pilot house. The glass was gone, the steel was buckled, and the only light came from the faint green glow of the binnacle, which he'd covered with a canvas hood. He was navigating by memory, by the stars, and by the primal instinct of a sea predator. But he was blind. "Mr. Reynolds," he whispered. The entire ship had adopted a forced silence. Shouts were forbidden. Communication was done by runners, or by sound-powered telephones that hissed with static. "What's the status on the forward turrets?" "Manned and ready, sir," Reynolds whispered back. His voice was a dry rasp. "Gunnery officer is in Mount 2. He's improvised. He's slaved the triggers for both turrets to his position. He'll be firing them manually. No directors, no fire control. Just pointing." "And the torpedoes?" "Tubes are trained to starboard, 0 degrees. We have 2 fish. That's it. The manual cranks are oiled, but... Skipper, if they get close enough for those torpedoes to be a sure thing, we'll be close enough to throw rocks at them." "That's the point, Lieutenant," Thorne said, his teeth a pale slash in the gloom. "They will not see us. They will not look for us. They will see a burning wreck, a navigational hazard. They'll pass us to starboard, giving us a wide berth to avoid the wreckage, and they'll expose their port quarters to us." This was the core of the plan. It was not just an ambush. It was a matador's trick. To stand perfectly still, to wave the red cape of their own sinking, and to wait for the bull to charge by. In Mount 1, the forwardmost 5-inch gun, Ensign Harris, the young gunnery officer, was living his own personal nightmare. He was cramped in the metal box with his crew, the turret reeking of sweat, oil, and fear. They had no power. The hydraulic rammers were dead. The shell and the powder charge had to be muscled into the breech by hand, an exhausting slow-motion process. They had loaded 1 star shell, an illumination round, into Mount 1 and 1 high-explosive round into Mount 2. That was their opening salvo. "Remember, boys," Harris whispered, his voice cracking. He was 22. "We don't fire until the commander gives the word. We don't move. We don't even breathe heavy. We are ghosts until the word is given." His hands were gripping the manual traverse wheel. It was cold. He tried to wipe his sweaty palms on his fatigues, but they were already soaked in a mixture of seawater and fuel oil. He could feel the ship's slow, sickening wallow. She was not stable. She was a wounded animal, barely balanced by Malone's desperate counter-flooding. Firing the guns, the sheer kinetic recoil, might be enough to capsize them. It was a terrifying, unspoken possibility. They might fire one shot and, in the act, destroy themselves. Below decks, Malone was the king of a rotting empire. His damage control teams were not resting. They were in a constant, desperate war. The sea was an intelligent, relentless enemy. It found new ways in, through stressed rivets, through buckled welding seams. His men, their faces black with soot and their eyes red with exhaustion, moved through the dark, chest-deep water like wraiths. They were shoring up a bulkhead in compartment C3 when they heard it. It was not the ship. It was not the sea. It was a sound from the sky. A low, unsteady drone. A multi-engine aircraft flying low. The effect on the Harridan was electric. A collective, silent gasp. Every man froze. On the forecastle, a man who had been trying to secure a loose hatch cover simply stopped. His wrench held in midair. On the bridge, Thorne's head snapped up. Plane, Reynolds breathed, stating the obvious. Japanese, Thorne confirmed. It was a Mavis, or a Betty, a night prowler, a scout. The sound grew louder, circling. They were being observed. This was the first test. The pilot, probably on a routine patrol of the slot, had seen Malone's smoke. He was coming to investigate the kill his comrades had reported. "Nobody moves!" Thorne's whisper was a steel blade. "Not a man! You are part of the wreckage! Become steel, now!" The plane was low, frighteningly low. The men on the bridge could see its dark, wide-winged silhouette against the faintly lit clouds. It was a G4M Betty bomber, its engines unsynchronized, giving it that distinct, loping growl. It made a pass directly over the ship. The men in the open gun tubs of the 40mm mounts, who were supposed to be dead, pressed themselves against the steel bulwarks, their faces turned down, praying the darkness would hide the pale white of their skin. Then, the pilot did something that turned Thorne's blood to ice. A bright magnesium-white light popped in the sky, 1,000 feet above them. A flare. The Japanese pilot had dropped a parachute flare to get a better look at his handiwork. The world exploded in light. It was not like sunlight. It was a cold, chemical, sterile white that was brighter than day. It cast hard, black shadows that seemed to jump and writhe. The Harridan was exposed in all her agony. The flare illuminated the massive, gaping torpedo wound in her bow, the canted deck, the twisted metal of the aft guns, and the oily water that pooled around her. It also illuminated the men. In Mount 2, Ensign Harris saw the blinding light seep through the gun's optic sights. He heard one of his men suck in a breath, a sound that was like a scream in the silence. "Don't look up," Harris commanded, his own eyes squeezed shut. On the bridge, Thorne and Reynolds were frozen. They were silhouetted against the bulkhead, two statues. If they moved, if they even flinched. The flare descended slowly, dangling from its small parachute, hissing. It was a terrifying, accusatory eye. The Japanese pilot was circling it, observing. He would see the ship. He would see the smoke. It was perfect. It looked exactly like a destroyer that had been torpedoed 6 hours ago and was now in its death throes, burning itself out. But would he see the men? Would he see the glint of an oiled gun barrel? Would he see the faint ripple of a life raft that was still, inexplicably, tied to the deck? The flare was hypnotic. It drifted down. Down. And then, with a final bright sputter, it hit the water and was extinguished. The darkness that returned was absolute. It was a physical blow, leaving the men blind, their eyes seared by the magnesium. A full minute passed. The only sound was the thrum of the Betty's engines. He was making one final pass. Thorne did not dare to breathe. He could feel the vibration of the engines through the deck. The pilot was so close. He felt he could reach out and touch the plane. And then, the sound changed. The drone grew fainter, shifted pitch. The pilot was satisfied. He had seen the wreck. He had confirmed the kill. He was heading home. A long collective shuddering sigh passed through the Harridan. It was a sound that was not a sound. The exhalation of 200 men who had just stared into the face of God and been found wanting. "Malone," Thorne said into the voice tube, his own voice unsteady for the first time. Give me a little more smoke. Let's make the performance convincing." "Aye, Skipper." The voice came back, shaky. More smoke. Coming right up. The wait resumed, but it was different now. They had passed the test. The fear, the acute, sharp terror was replaced by something else. A cold, hard, and patient anger. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now they just had to wait for the real predators. On the bridge, the ship's cook, a man named Spoons, who was now acting as a lookout, touched Thorne on the arm. He didn't speak. He just pointed. To the northwest. A faint, low vibration. Not a plane. Something in the water. Thorne picked up his binoculars, though he knew they were useless in the dark. He strained his ears. It was there. A rhythmic, high-speed thumping. The sound of destroyers. The sound of turbines at full speed. Thorne looked at his watch. 23:40. "Right on time," he whispered to Reynolds. "The express is in the station. All hands. Stand to." The sound of the approaching Tokyo Express was nothing like the drone of the aircraft. This was a physical force, a vibration that traveled through the water and into the very keel of the Harridan. It was a deep, guttural, high-frequency thrum, the sound of multiple high-performance turbines spinning at flank speed. For the men in the flooded lower decks, the sound was transmitted directly into their bones, a terrifying, impending rhythm. They were not just destroyers, they were scalpels. They were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, running a supply line they considered their private, untouchable domain. And they were coming. On the bridge, Commander Thorne, his binoculars now pressed so hard against his sockets they hurt, saw them. He was not the first. The lookout, Spoons, saw them, hissing, "Oh, sweet Jesus," under his breath. They were not lights. They were shapes. The Japanese, masters of night warfare, ran completely dark. What gave them away was the water. In the phosphorescent tropical sea, their bows, cutting the water at over 30 knots, created 3 distinct, glowing bones in their teeth, luminous white V's of spray. 3 of them. 3 Kagero-class destroyers, the deadliest in the world, in a perfect, tight column. 3 of them, Skipper, Reynolds whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped the compass housing. "Lined up like ducks. They're passing us," Thorne breathed. The plan was working. The lead Japanese destroyer, probably the flagship, was already a beam of the Harridan's bow. They were passing to starboard, just as he'd predicted, giving the burning wreck a respectful wide berth of about 200 yards. It was a knife fight range, close enough to see the silhouettes of their masts against the stars, close enough to hear the hiss of their passage over the water. The Japanese lookouts, if they saw the Harridan at all, saw exactly what Malone's fires intended: a smoldering, broken hulk, another piece of debris, an iron-bottom sound. They did not slow, they did not vary course. They were focused on their mission, on getting to Guadalcanal, dropping their cargo and getting out before the American bombers from Henderson Field could catch them at sunrise. Thorne waited. The lead ship was passing. The second ship was approaching. This was the one. The second ship in the column, the meatiest part of the target. He watched the glowing bow wave of the second destroyer, the Akikaze, though he didn't know her name. He just knew she was his. He let her come level with his bridge. He could feel the pulse in his throat. The entire Harridan was holding its breath, 200 men, frozen, waiting for one word. "Now," Thorne said, his voice calm, clear, and utterly cold. "Illuminate." He spoke into the voice tube. Gunnery, fire star shell. In Mount 1, Ensign Harris, who had been tracking the dark shape by eye, his muscles screaming, heard the command. "Fire!" The crew, acting on pure adrenal-fueled muscle memory, slammed the manual firing lever. The 5-inch gun barked. The sound was shocking. a physical punch that rocked the already unstable destroyer. The Harridan shuddered violently, listing hard to port from the recoil, causing men below to be thrown from their feet into the oily water. The ship groaned in protest. A second later, the sky, 500 yards away, lit up. The star shell popped, hanging in the air, a miniature sun that cast a brilliant, harsh, and horrifying light. It illuminated a perfect portrait of naval warfare. There, caught in the white glare, was the Akikaze. Her crew, who had been topside, were visible, their heads turned in stunned confusion, their faces pale, looking up at the impossible light. They were so close. "Gunnery?" Thorne's voice did not rise. "Fire for effect." In Mount 2, they didn't wait for Harris to relay. They had the order. The high explosive round was already loaded. "Fire!" The second 5-inch gun roared. This time the crew was braced for it. Because they had no fire control, no radar, just a young ensign aiming a 14-ton rifle by eye in the dark, the shot was imperfect. It wasn't a direct hit to the waterline, it was high. The shell, traveling at 600 feet per second, screamed across the narrow gap of water and smashed directly into the bridge of the Akikaze. The explosion was instantaneous and spectacular. The entire command structure of the Japanese destroyer vanished in a flash of orange, yellow, and black. Metal, glass, and men were atomized. The Akikaze's command was gone. Her steering was gone. Her radio room was gone. She was a decapitated ship. "Torpedoes," Thorne said, his voice now rising, a hunter's cry. "Fire, 1 and 2. The torpedo officer, who had been waiting for this word as if for salvation, screamed the order. "Fire!" The 2 torpedoes, the Harridan's last remaining sting, leapt from their tubes with a whoosh of compressed air. They hit the water with a splash, and their tiny, high-speed propellers began to turn. They were running hot, straight, and true. They were aimed not at the Akikaze, which was already a dying ship, but at the third ship in the column, the Unagi, which was now in a state of complete, panicked chaos, turning hard to port to unmask its own batteries. The Akikaze, meanwhile, had begun to burn. The star shell, its purpose served, flickered and died, plunging the world back into darkness. But it didn't matter. The Akikaze was now illuminating itself, a blazing funeral pyre. But the ghost had been revealed, and the Japanese were not cowards. The lead destroyer, the Kawakaze, which was already past the Harridan, had reacted with terrifying speed. Her captain, realizing he was being ambushed by something, did not run. He turned 180 degrees, his turbines screaming, his searchlights blazing on. It was like a curtain rising on a stage of hell. 2 brilliant, blinding beams of white light shot across the water and locked onto the Harridan. In that instant, the ruse was over. The Harridan was no longer a sinking ship. She was a target. She was the only target. "Open fire," the Kawakaze's captain roared over his radio. The Harridan was suddenly, brutally, and systematically ripped apart. The Kawakaze and the Unagi, the third ship, opened up with everything they had. Their 5-inch guns, guided by superior Japanese optics and directors, began to walk shells across the Harridan's hull. The first shell hit the forecastle, right between the 2 5-inch turrets. The explosion was deafening. It tore Ensign Harris's gun, Mount 1, from its ring mount, flipping the entire 14-ton turret over like a child's toy. The men inside were killed instantly. The second shell struck the bridge. Commander Thorne never saw it coming. The world simply exploded. The shell, a high explosive round, detonated against the thin steel of the pilot house. Shrapnel, hot and razor-sharp, ripped through the small space. Lieutenant Reynolds, who had been standing next to Thorne, was thrown backward, his chest opened. "Spoons!" The lookout was simply gone. Thorne himself was hurled against the aft bulkhead, his right side a searing canvas of pain. A piece of shrapnel the size of a fist was buried in his shoulder, and his right leg was a ruin, the bone shattered. He slid to the deck, his vision graying, the world reduced to a high-pitched whine. But as he fell, he saw it. Out in the darkness, the 2 torpedoes, which had been on their 45-second run, reached their destination. The Unagi, the third destroyer, which was still turning, trying to get its guns on target, crossed their path. The first torpedo struck her amidships, right in the engine room. The second struck just aft. The Unagi did not just explode, she disintegrated. A column of water, fire, and steel rose 1,000 feet into the night sky. The explosion was so powerful it created a pressure wave that washed over the Harridan's deck, putting out some of Malone's decoy fires. The Unagi was broken in two. Her bow and her stern, both pointing to the sky, began to sink, vanishing in less than 30 seconds. One dead, one crippled. On the deck of the Harridan, men who were being strafed by the Kawakaze's machine guns, men who were on fire, men who were dying, saw it. And they cheered. It was a raw, primal, guttural roar of triumph and defiance, but the Kawakaze was now vengeful. It was a one-on-one fight, a healthy, fully armed destroyer against a dead-in-the-water, burning wreck that was now taking on water from dozens of shell holes. On the ruined bridge, Thorn was fading. He could hear the screams. He could smell his own ship burning, not Malone's decoy smoke, but the real acrid smell of electrical fires, burning paint, and cooking flesh. He tried to push himself up. His leg wouldn't respond. A young sailor, a runner he didn't even know, scrambled onto the bridge, his face a mask of terror. "Sir, the bridge is... Oh my God! Sir, the skipper's hit. The XO is dead." Thorn grabbed the boy's shirt with his good hand. "Tell Malone." He coughed, blood spattering his lips. "Tell him, open the valves. The port side, level us." "Sir, we're sinking," the boy cried. "We were always sinking," Thorn roared, a sudden shocking burst of strength. "Now get Malone. Tell him. Fight the ship. Fight the ship until she's under." The Kawakaze was circling, like a shark that had tasted blood, pumping shell after shell into the floating corpse. The Harridan's moment of triumph was over. The cost of that triumph was now being paid, in full, in blood and fire. The sinking ship was now truly dying. For Torpedoman's mate third class, Jake Riley, the world had shrunk to a few square feet of scorched, twisted steel. He, the ship's cook, Grease Popowski, and a shell-shocked radio man named Frenchie were all that was left of the aft torpedo crew. They were clinging to the buckled mount, lit up like stage actors by the Kawakaze's merciless searchlights. The Japanese destroyer was circling closer now, its 25mm cannons chattering, the green tracers streaming past their heads with a sound like tearing canvas. The ship was a slaughterhouse. Men were screaming, jumping into the sea, their bodies silhouetted by the fires before the water extinguished their cries. And Riley was waiting for a signal. He was waiting for Lieutenant Malone. "Where is it?" Riley yelled over the din, his hands on the cold manual crank. "Where's the signal, sir?" He ain't coming," Popowski roared, his thick Boston accent cutting through the panic. Popowski was a big man, his white uniform black with soot and blood. He was holding, of all things, a heavy iron skillet from his galley, gripping it like a shield. "We're done, kid. We're all done." The Kawakaze was turning. She was coming in, a great black shark, for the final point-blank kill. Her captain, perhaps unnerved by the sheer stubborn refusal of this wreck to die, had decided to finish it with a volley that couldn't miss. She was turning hard to port, to bring her full broadside to bear, a move that would, for one brief, fatal moment, present her own full profile to the Harridan's stern. "Now!" Riley screamed, seeing the angle. "They're in the sights! Turn! Turn, damn you!" He and Frenchie threw their combined weight on the manual traverse crank. It moved, but with an agonizing, scraping shriek. The heat from the fires had warped the bearings. "It's jammed," Frenchie cried, his voice a high-pitched wail. "It won't. Move." "It's over," Riley whispered, his hope shattering. The Kawakaze was lining up. This was the end. They had 2, maybe 3, seconds to live. And then, it happened. Malone's last act. From the guts of the Harridan, from the compartment where Fix-It Malone had been vaporized, a new force erupted. The ruptured main steam line, fed by the last of the boiler's pressure, found a vent. A shell hole, with a sound that was not a hiss but a shriek, a banshee's wail that tore through the night. A geyser of pure, white, pressurized steam erupted from the Harridan's starboard side, a ghostly pillar that shot 200 feet into the air. The effect was instantaneous. The Kawakazi's 2 searchlights, which had been locked on the aft deck, instinctively snapped to this new, violent, and utterly terrifying phenomenon. The Japanese captain, seeing a burning ship explode with a pillar of steam, must have thought the Harridan's magazines were finally, catastrophically exploding. In that instant, the searchlights were off the torpedo mount. They were blinded by the steam, and in that same instant, the Kawakazi captain, in a moment of panic, continued his turn, trying to get away from the exploding wreck. He turned right into their sights. "It's still jammed, kid," Popowski bellowed. "Hit it," Riley screamed, his voice raw. "Hit the pin." The Kawakazi was there. A perfect shot. 400 yards. Broadside. Popowski, the cook, Grease Popowski, roared. It was not a sound of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised his iron skillet, the one he'd carried from his ruined galley, and smashed it, with the force of a desperate, dying man, against the manual firing pin housing of the torpedo. There was no clean click. There was the sound of breaking metal, a crack shrank. The mechanism, shattered by the blow, sheared off. The firing pin was struck, with a subdued, almost polite whoosh of compressed air. The last torpedo of the USS Harridan, its ghost fish, slid from the tube. It hit the water with a sloppy plop. For a second, nothing. The torpedo wallowed. "It's a dud!" Frenchie screamed, tears streaming down his face. "No," Riley whispered, watching. The torpedo's engine starved for a second, caught. A thin stream of bubbles appeared. The whir of its propellers began, and it streaked, hot, straight and true, across the narrow ribbon of dark water. On the Kawakazi, they never even saw it. They were still blinded by the steam, still reacting to the explosion. The torpedo, the Harridan's very last bullet, struck the Kawakazi directly under her forward magazine. The night did not explode. It ended. The universe was replaced by a single blinding white flash. The Kawakazi, with all her remaining ammunition, her own torpedoes, her shells, her powder, detonated in one sympathetic, apocalyptic blast. A fireball, silent for a long second, billowed into the sky, mushrooming a mile high, illuminating the entire ocean, revealing the burning wreck of the Akikazi in the distance, and the stunned faces of the men in the water. Then the sound wave hit, a physical, crushing blow, a concussive force that was louder than God, that deafened Riley and threw him and his men from the mount like dolls. And then, silence. Where the Kawakazi had been, there was nothing, not a wreck, not debris, not even an oil slick. The ship and her entire crew had been erased from existence. The battle was over. The Harridan had won. In the sudden, impossible quiet, the only sounds were the groans of the dying, the hiss of the Harridan's own fires, and the lapping of the sea. The ship, her last desperate act complete, finally gave up the ghost. The shock of the Kawakazi's explosion, combined with Malone's deliberate counterflooding, was the final straw. She was no longer a ship. She was just a collection of steel plates, held together by memory. On the ruined bridge, Commander Elias Thorne, who had been lying in a pool of his own blood, felt the silence. The pain was gone. He felt cold. He opened his eyes. He saw the fire on the horizon where the Kawakazi used to be. He saw the distant, dying embers of the Akikazi. He saw his own decks, now awash, level with the sea. He had no crew. He had no ship. But he had victory. He found the 1MC microphone, the one wire that, by some profound miracle, was still connected to the emergency battery. He pressed the switch. His voice, a dry, bloody whisper, crackled over the few remaining speakers, a voice from the grave. Abandoned ship. The men in the water, the survivors, Riley and Popowski among them, heard it. They looked back at the wreck of their home. Abandoned ship. Men, all hands, abandoned ship. We got them. There was a pause, a rattling cough. "Well done, Harridan. Well done." The microphone thudded as it dropped. Commander Thorne, his last order given, slumped over, his eyes on the horizon. He was dead. The USS Harridan did not sink in a fiery cascade. She simply settled. The crew, the 60 or 70 remaining survivors, slipped off her decks into the warm, oily water. The ship, as if sighing, accepted the sea. The water washed over her decks, her broken guns, her silent bridge. The last of her fires were extinguished with a final, dying hiss. By 01:15, she was gone. The sinking ship had finally sunk. At dawn, a PBY Catalina, drawn by the pillar of smoke from the Akikaze and the massive oil slick where the Kawakaze had vanished, found them. 63 survivors, clinging to rafts, debris, and each other. The official report was sanitized. The USS Harridan, DD-391, was declared lost in action while engaging a superior enemy force. But in the secret post-action reports, the truth was told. And the Japanese, in their own logs, were terrified. 3 of their best destroyers, their untouchable Express, had been ambushed and destroyed by what their reconnaissance had confirmed was a single sinking wreck. They couldn't explain it. The Tokyo Express was halted. For 3 critical weeks, supplies to Guadalcanal stopped. The route was compromised, haunted by a ghost. That pause was all the Marines on the island needed. The Harridan had been a weapon. She had been counted as lost. But in her final dying hour, she had refused to go. She had used her own death as a camo, her own wounds as a trap. She was the most unlikely hero of the war, a ship that proved that in the end, it is not the steel, but the will that decides the fight.